Welcome back to the Goku Report, and welcome back to a special new top 10 list. Something for the most part I try to stay out of, especially my main channel. Politics is forbidden, but with that said, decide to do a special top 10 list. In the future, sometime may do another top 10 list involving the same subject matter. Uh, Want to mention and update and stuff like today, my top 10 personal favorite presidents of all time. Sometime in the future, I may do a top 10 worst presidents list. We'll see. With that said, I'm looking at the presidents based on strictly what they did in office, not including anything in their private life or personal life outside of strictly the position as the commander in chief. So keep that in mind. That's our rank. So there may be one or two people on this list I wouldn't have on my list if I was basing strictly on including personal matters, but given them strictly looking at what they did in office. So with that said, three honorable mentions. The first of which is I think it's somewhat, yeah, he didn't do a huge amount of great stuff, but I still actually think he was a halfway decent president looking back at his policies and things. The first of the honorable mentions is William Taft, which of course would end up president after Theodore Roosevelt. Um, Second honorable mention, um, surprisingly, I don't hear a lot of people talking usually policy, though I think for the most part of this president, I actually think his presidency was relatively good and sturdy. I think quite a few of the policies he did, there were some questionable things here and there, but I think the good outweighs the bad. The second of the three honorable mentions is Harry Truman. And the last of the honorable mentions, once upon a time, was in my top 10. He has dropped a little, but I think he still did do quite a few positive things when he was in office. But I feel, looking back at certain things, some of his negatives, I think, somewhat outweighed the positives enough to drop out the top 10. The last honorable mention is Herbert Walker Bush. I've always, to an extent, I've always appreciated a lot of things that Herbert Walker did, going more proper means through working with other nations on things. There were definitely some questionable things, I will say, looking back, but strictly his presidency, not including from when he held other positions of power prior to the presidency. Some questions, but I still think he was a decent overall president, at least especially compared to his son. With that said, coming at number 10, I think is one of the more underrated presidents, and looking back at many policies, I think he actually was a pretty decent president. For me personally, at number 10 is James K. Polk. Surprisingly, he's a president I don't see a lot of YouTubers actually talk about, at least in the top, like, levels. A lot of people tend to rank him like mid tier between all the presidents. But there are a few specific, YouTubers I like to follow occasionally, listen to their perspectives on political matters and history of presidents. One is Mr. Beat. If you've never checked out his channel, I recommend checking it out, as well as a certain someone that goes by Tiger, was it Landstar or something like that? Tiger Star, which has a lot of really interesting historical views and what if scenarios that I recommend checking out. But Mr. B is a definite good one to check out, given he's also a history teacher. But yeah, for me at 10 is James K. Polk. Number 9 is a tie between two people. One I feel is a bit overrated. I think he's still arguably one of the best presidents. I just feel some people hold him in much higher regards than they really should. Looking at some of his policies and things, yes, I admit he has done a lot of positives and definitely a lot of iconic moments in his presidency. But I feel certain moments end up making people end up, especially people that are hardcore Republicans, I feel overrate this president. But for me, tied at number nine, one is between a overrated president and someone who people let their personal life matters overshadow their actual policies in office. The first, tied at number nine, first is Ronald Reagan. Like I said, yes, I think he was a decent president, many iconic moments and stuff. But with that said, I think Reagan really is overrated, in my personal opinion. Speaking as somebody who once upon a time started out was a Republican, but in more recent years and stuff, I went and became independent, though my political perspectives lean more that of libertarian. So, with that said, as somebody who is third party, neutral, yeah, for me, I think Reagan was a good president, but I think many specific policies and things he did in office, there was definitely some questionable moments in his presidency. Now, the thing is, some things, it's hard to see if he actually had the knowledge on things that happened or not, or could have been out of the know and instead could have been at the time Vice President Herbert Walker. It's hard to say at the end of the day. But tied with him at number nine is, I think, a president that I think is, in modern Democrats, in my opinion, is the best, probably, Democrat president in the last, what, like 40 plus years. For me, tied at number nine is Bill Clinton. Like I said, personal stuff has overshadowed, I think, a lot of his actual policies, but if you look actually back at many things Bill Clinton implemented as president, I think actually were a lot of the positives. Like, he really would end up doing, passing a lot of bills and stuff, uh, doing a lot of positives. There are definitely some very questionable things. Now, a lot of people want to blame him for the North American Trade Agreement, aka NAFTA, though, to be fair, a lot of NAFTA really was implemented under Herbert Walker Bush, not under Clinton. Clinton always gets pretty much the blame for it, though actually Herbert Walker was the one who started the implementation of NAFTA. But with that said, yeah, for the most part, I actually think looking back, and I think more people will probably look back at Clinton as a pretty overall positive person. He is, surprisingly, if you look at him when he was in office, he was very much a moderate in his perspective and how he did things. He was much more willing to work with the Republican Party, obviously at the time gained power in '94 with Newt Gingrich as Speaker of the House. But quite fascinating, and I think honestly a somewhat underrated president on certain perspectives. Sadly, everyone always talks about Monica Lewinsky when there's much more positives I think outweigh the negatives with Bill Clinton. Coming at number eight, I think was probably the best Democrat president, at least until Bill Clinton, personally. Coming at number eight was, I think, a perfect example, really, of the really success and stuff. And unfortunately, we never really got to see overall how his overall presidency would have been. Hard to say given his assassination, unfortunately. But coming at number eight, and I think he proved his leadership with how he handled the Cuban Missile Crisis. For me, coming at number eight is John F. Kennedy. Coming in at number seven is somebody I feel gets another one that gets more hate than he should. He actually did quite a few positives, sadly, on certain issues I think he was a little weak on. But overall, for me, number seven is Grant, or Ulysses S. Grant. For me, I feel he was actually one of the better presidents, sadly, more overlooked presidents. Obviously, he was part of, at the time, the very young Progressive Republican Party, which of course he, being obviously somebody who would take the mantle of many things that specifically um, Abraham Lincoln would start and Grant would try to continue. I think Grant actually did definitely some positives, and he really helped. Also, was very influential on continuing a lot of stuff on making sure there was freedom for, at the time, of course, slaves and stuff. And that's something a lot of people don't realize, that Grant actually was pretty hands on in these areas, and he was actually, I think, a much better president than a lot of people give him credit for. And he was actually much smarter. The problem is he didn't always know the best people surrounding himself with. Unfortunately, he wasn't always the best judge of character. That was one of his flaws. Coming at number 6, another, I think, current president in years, as I've learned more history about this specific president, the more I genuinely like him, which is why he's at number 6. For me, probably one of the most criminally underrated presidents of all time. And number 6 is Calvin Coolidge. If you don't know much about Calvin Coolidge, I recommend actually looking up, do some recently in-depth history research. He was actually quite an interesting president, and he definitely did many, I think, very important things he would end up implementing throughout his presidency, and I would say he was somewhat of a pretty successful president at the time when he took office. It is unfortunate that a lot of historians overlook him, which is unfortunate because he was fairly consistent with many things he would do, and it's unfortunate he's been overshadowed by many more larger than life icon presidents, as they would say. Coming at number 5 was definitely an iconic president, became famous for his outgoing speech talking about telling people to beware of the military-industrial complex. Coming in at number 5 for me personally, somebody it's always been one of my personal favorite presidents. I think deserves a lot of respect for a lot of things he did in office. That is, coming at number 5 for me is Dwight D. Eisenhower, which I'll be honest, growing up, I heard quite a bit of stories about Dwight D. Eisenhower when I was a kid, because my grandparents were very big, avid supporters of Eisenhower, especially my grandfather. And I will say, I see, looking back on many policies and many things he did, I see why my grandparents very much highly respected and loved Eisenhower, and why they voted for him when he came into office many years ago. He did many good and positive things, and he was somewhat of a realist, and I think realized a great many things, was ahead of his time in certain areas. And there's a lot of key things I think we have today that a lot of credit needs to go to Eisenhower, who was a former major general in the military, and he understood more than anyone about the dangers and the power of the military industrial complex, which is why he tried to warn people. Coming in at number 4 is arguably one of the most important of the founding fathers, in my opinion, and probably one of the greatest, definitely one of the most intelligent of the founding fathers and early presidents for me. And I recommend personally really checking out a superb, surprisingly in-depth mini-series done by HBO, actually, on this individual. And that is coming at number 4 for me personally, John Adams. Arguably one of my favorite early presidents, hands down, of all time. Of course, the fact he was a lawyer is no surprise. His intelligence, though not all lawyers have, unfortunately, common sense factor. Now, John Adams, at least, realized a lot of importance for many things, and the fact he was one of the founding fathers who wanted early on, did not want slavery to be allowed. He wanted to abolish slavery from the get-go. At the end of the day, sadly, many overall, the founding fathers outnumbered him, unfortunately, so he lost that battle. But I think had many of people listened to John Adams when he was around helping to draft the Constitution as well as president, I think many things that would happen many years in the future, like the Civil War, may have been avoided had people have actually listened to John Adams. Coming in at number three is arguably my favorite Republican president of all time. The key importance and the amount of things he did as president is amazing. How much, even though he was a major hunter and stuff and a military man, he would end up the one who would basically preserve millions of acres and institute and create many government parks to save and preserve so much beautiful landscape throughout the country, as well as definitely some questionable things, but he also helped create the USDA and would help create in order to make sure like meat and things were actually safe, because when you learn about a lot of the process in the food industry, plus also he wanted to break up monopolies. And that is arguably, in my opinion, of modern presidents of the 20th century, he is the most important president of the 20th century easily. Coming in at number three for me, and admittedly somewhat, he's very close to number two, but for me at number three is Theodore Roosevelt, or Teddy Roosevelt. Yes, I absolutely love, and someday if anybody would be interested, I'd love to make like just specifically a video on many of the positives, I think, and more important issues and stuff that Theodore Roosevelt, unfortunately, he also had a very big ego, which unfortunately would get him involved to fight Taft when Taft would run for re-election and would allow a certain someone to gain power, which I may talk about in the future with the top 10 worst presidents. I may talk about this individual because I very much despise this person. But with that said, yes, I still nevertheless love TR and always will love Teddy Roosevelt for the many positives and things he did going after the corrupted elites like J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, Carnegie, and many others. Coming at number two was the original first president. I'm sure many people always usually have him at number one, but for me, looking back more at historical stuff and these few individuals, I've done quite a few deep dives learning more and more stuff about. For me, coming at number two is George Washington, the original president and arguably one of the key individuals of the founding fathers. Obviously, as early on, he was, of course, a general actually in the British Army for many years, and he was involved in the French Indian War, which is a topic sometime I might actually like to talk about. I think it's one of the more interesting conflicts in our nation's early era as well as in history, because the area I live in, the Ohio River Valley, was a key area actually for the French Indian War. And in fact, a couple of things near actually would be founded during this era, such as Point Pleasant would be founded, and the key figure that would help actually George Washington would travel up and down there, as well as at one time, as well as Guyandot was a fort local area. Still quite fascinating overall. Coming at number one for me personally is Abraham Lincoln. Comes at number one. Lincoln arguably is very key, important figure throughout history, and the fact he did many positives. Yes, there was occasionally definitely some questionable things, but he started one, of course, obviously, one of the things he did was free the slaves. And there were many policies he started to implement. Unfortunately, he would be assassinated, but luckily, a certain person named Ulysses S. Grant would continue and finish many projects and things that Abraham Lincoln would start. But I think at the end of the day, I think many people we'll realize, obviously, the importance in such a great president Lincoln was. Actually, when I said earlier about Theodore Roosevelt being my favorite Republican president, obviously incorrect. Favorite is Lincoln. But looking back historically, I think pretty much everyone really much admires and respects. And the thing is, Lincoln does not get enough credit, though, when it comes to as a politician. He was genuinely very shrewd and very highly intelligent when it came to being a politician. He didn't get enough credit for that because when he ran for office and got in, he put pretty much all his opponents that fought to get the Republican nomination stuff and to become president, he put his own cabinet so that way he could keep a close eye on all of them at all times. That goes to prove how intelligent and smart, common sense Lincoln was. And at the end of the day, it is sad though, looking at the same time, he also had definitely quite a sad life and sad moments throughout his life, obviously, when he lost his son, as well as interesting fact, when he was president, though, his wife actually would have seances in the White House to try to contact their passed away son. But that's something we might talk about in the future, sometime possibly. But indeed, I think when it comes down, history will definitely, I feel, remember forever, hopefully, Lincoln as a true great leader. Somebody that many, I think, Republicans today should look up to. Today, people call themselves, like, a lot of modern Republicans call themselves, like, or the GOP party is the party of Reagan. I feel maybe you should go back in history and call yourself either the party of Roosevelt or the party of Lincoln. Because they are much more important historical figures and actually proved how important they were to our actual history and development as a nation. Versus somebody who looked good on TV and everything. But at the end of the day, that's it. That is my top 10 personal favorite presidents of all time. Leave a comment, tell me, and let's try to keep the comments somewhat peaceful and calm. So with that said, I'll see y'all next time, and sometime future I will do a top 10 worst presidents list, but just a quick note, I will not be including on anything Biden because he's a current president, so he will not be included on anything. So, just so you know, I think it's too early to tell overall, and the same thing goes with the previous president. I think it's too early to tell how history will reflect on him as well. But anyways, with that said, stay safe. See you again soon. Same YouTube time, same YouTube channel.